Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the legislative process, which is part 2 of my lecture on Congress. So let's get right into the material. So in today's lesson overview, we're going to go over, we're going to describe the committee system in Congress and the types of committees. We're going to identify the 3 exclusive committees in the House. We're going to differentiate between the role of trustee and delegate as a congressman. Now again, there might be many other rules, but we're going to narrow it down to 2 basic ways that congressmen can actually see their role as members in the House or the Senate. And then we're going to explain the legislative and non-legislative powers of both the House and the Senate. Now there's some similarities and there's some differences, and we're going to highlight these differences. And then we're going to chart the path that a bill takes as it journeys on the road towards becoming a law. I'll provide a link for this. It should be on the bottom here, but one of the things that it would be a good thing to watch, very simplistic, but Schoolhouse Rocks. It talks about a bill and the process it goes towards becoming a law. It's actually surprisingly really accurate. One of the things that I have my AP students do prior to being prepared for the AP exam. The I'm Just a Bill, Only a Bill. If you can watch that song and memorize it, it gives you a really good structure of how the bill making process actually works. And then we're finally going to examine some of the legislative tactics that Congress uses to prevent passage of the bill or pursue their own projects. So there are things that, congressmen, they want to get their way, and so they're going to use the full powers that they have as members to try to, go to kill a bill or just pass things that aren't really in the interest of the country as a whole, but individually. All right, the committee system. This is where most of the work of Congress is actually accomplished. It's through committees, or more specifically, subcommittees. So if you've ever visited Washington, D.C., if you hear the bell ringing near the Capitol, that means that it's time to actually go and make the vote. Now, I actually had the opportunity to go with a member of Congress in an underground tram station. My representative was able to take me underground, and only members can actually access that. But basically, they go from their office building, they go underground, and they get to the Capitol building, and they basically vote. Now they vote, but not a lot of work, not any work is done. The work that it takes to get the bill to the floor, all that work is done through committee. So when it gets to the floor, basically it's an up and down vote for the most part. So all the work that goes into the specific the specifics of the bill, that's all done in committee and subcommittees. Now the committee chairpersons, they're going to be members of the majority party in each house, chosen by a party caucus. So it's very important to be in the majority party. If you really want the power really comes from being in the majority party. Now, obviously, something you can't necessarily control, but there are definitely perks of being in the majority. Seniority is one criterion that's used to select chairperson. It used to be actually a lot more significant than it is today. In the 20th century, that was the primary consideration as far as committee assignments goes. But today, the leadership, they take into account talent. They take into account, leadership qualities. So if you're a freshman congressman, meaning that you're elected for the first time, chances are you're not going to get exactly what you want in committee assignments. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna get the best pick if you are a senior member. There's got to be other criteria that you have to meet as well. It should be. Now, types of committees, there are 3 specific committees that I'm going to focus on. There's a standing committee, select committee, and conference committee. Okay, they each all have their purpose. Now, at least for the AP exam, the multiple choice questions that you're going to get, what kind of committee is permanent? Which one are the committees that congressmen are involved with on a permanent basis, at least for that term, and it's the standing committee. So standing committees are permanent committees that deals with specific policy matters. For example, agriculture, energy and natural resources, and veteran affairs. So each time an individual can be part of maybe 2 committees at most, and they're assigned to 2 committees, and they sit on different subcommittees, and they're responsible for that. Now, if you're part of the exclusive committee, one of the top 3 committees, then you are not permitted to be part of any other committee, simply because being part of these exclusive committees, you're granted a significant amount of power. But these standing committees, each Congress member has, again, kind of depending on their interests, but also, seniority, different factors, they're assigned different committee assignments. Now, if a congressman is more concerned with re-election, then that person might request a committee that might bring jobs to their constituents. So, for example, if you're bent on bringing water jobs to your districts, then you want to be part of the water committee, so to speak. Or if you're in the Midwest and you want to bring farming jobs, then you want to, or farming subsidies, then you want to be on the agriculture committee. If you're more of a congressman that really wants to deal with international relations and might not necessarily benefit your particular constituency, then you might want to be a committee on international relations. Who knows? If you're a congressman that likes to travel, then that might be one of the ways that you can achieve your goal of traveling. Now, they might not explicitly say that, but again, there are some perks with being a member in Congress. Okay, another type of committee is there's a select committee, and this is a temporary committee that's appointed for a specific purpose, usually when the president has not done something good. For example, Watergate, or during the Monica Lewinsky affair, there was a select committee that was, or actually, in this case, there's an independent committee that was appointed. But oftentimes Congress will be called upon to investigate certain actions, and Richard Nixon was never impeached and convicted because partly the work of the committee was done such that if President Nixon remained intransigent and decided to remain as president instead of resigning, pretty much would have been an open and shut case where he would have been impeached and convicted. And so the select committee actually did a good job in providing evidence against President Nixon. Now, there's also a conference committee, and that's a temporary committee that's created to iron out differences in the House and Senate versions of the bill. So the House will pass a bill. The Senate, they can produce the exact same bill. It's theoretically possible, but chances are the House and Senate, they have different rules, and so they have different provisions, and so they'll throw different things in there. And if they both pass, then it goes to conference committee, also kind of referred to as the third branch of Congress, so to speak, because this is where all the differences are ironed out, and it shoots right back to the House and the Senate, and based on that, the president will either sign or veto. So there's a lot of power in this conference committee, which is a joint committee between the House and the Senate, and they wield a lot of power because they have to reconcile the differences between the 2 versions of the bill. Okay. Now, the exclusive committees, these are the committees that you want to be on if you have a lot of ambition, and either you want to move up on the ranks, or let's say you just like having a lot of power in the House. So you have the House Committee on Appropriations, you have the Rules Committee, and the Committee of Ways and Means. So an easy multiple choice question, again, might be, which of the following is not an exclusive committee? Or they might give you a list of committees, and they say if your goal is to have the most power, or if you want to wield the most influence, which committee would you want to be on as a congressperson? And it's either one of these 3 committees: the House Committee on Appropriations, the Rules Committee, and the Committee of Ways and Means. Now, what does each of these committees do? Well, the Committee on Appropriations, they're responsible for setting specific expenditures of money by the government via appropriations bills. So specifically earmarking where the money goes, appropriating the money. It could be one thing to authorize something, but it's a much different thing to say, okay, where is this money specifically going? And if you're on that committee, every single bill that deals with appropriations, it's got to originate, it's got to come through the Committee on Appropriations. So that gives a lot of power to this particular committee. The Rules Committee, they determine the rules. And he who determines the rules, they have the power. It determines the rules other bills will operate under on the floor. So basically, it acts as a traffic cop of Congress. So basically, the Rules Committee will say this, and it says, okay, this will go on, but the limit of debate is only 2 minutes long, or so-and-so gets to speak on this matter. So the Rules Committee, again, the majority party, they're going to be able to control a lot of, dictate a lot of the rules of the debate. So again, it's really not fun to be the minority party, because you don't really get to set the rules. Now, there are, members of both parties are in each of the committees, but again, the majority rules. So really, the majority party, they have a lot more sway than the minority does. And then the third exclusive committee is the Committee of Ways and Means. So this is a chief tax writing committee, as all bills regarding taxation must originate from the House. Jurisdiction over income taxes, tariffs, Social Security, unemployment benefits, and Medicare. So things that deal with money, it starts off with the Committee of Ways and Means, and what doesn't really deal with money. So a lot of empowerment to the Ways and Means. Again, these three committees, again, as far as the AP exam is concerned, you want to know as being these exclusive committees that if your goal is to wield a lot of power in the House, you want to belong in one of these three committees. Now, there's, again, two different basic models on how a congressman is going to act once elected. So let's say you're an idealistic congressman. You really have to decide how you're going to define your not reign, but define your term as a congressman. And again, there could be a mixture of both, but again, there's two different philosophies, so neither is right or wrong, and they both have their pros and cons. But we'll go over what two models a congressman can basically look at his or her job as. So there's Congress as a delegate and Congress as a trustee. Now, what does it mean to be a delegate? Well, again, if you're a delegate, you go and you vote based on the will of the people. So delegates to the party's convention, well, they are supposed to vote for a particular candidate. Now, I discussed before, there are faithless electors that are supposed to vote for a candidate, but then they either switch their vote or abstain. And so basically, they don't fulfill their role as a delegate. So if you look at Congress members, they're supposed to vote based on the will of the people. So this model says that members vote based on the wishes of constituents, regardless of their own opinions. So let's say they may want to vote one way regarding gun control, but their constituents want to vote the opposite way. Well, as a delegate, you're gonna subjugate your own interest and vote based on the wishes of your constituents, and that's the way that a delegate would vote. Now, again, the House tends to reflect this delegate nature of members more so than the Senate. Now, again, this doesn't obviously have to be the case all the time, and again, depends on what portion of the term. A senator is probably more willing to be a delegate maybe in the 5th or 6th year prior to the election rather than the 1st or 2nd year. Simply because in the 1st or 2nd year you might lack as much incentive to follow what the constituents are telling you. But this is the idea, again, that you are kind of an arm of the people. You are the House of Representatives. You represent the people, so you as a delegate represent what the people want you to do, whether or not you agree with it or not. So that's one way to look at the role of a congressperson. The second way is Congress as a trustee. And members vote based on their conscience rather than the wishes of their constituents. So let's say, again, that gun control issue, your constituents are telling you, vote for gun control, vote for gun control, vote for gun control. And that's the overwhelming sense from the constituents. But in your mind, you read the Constitution and you say, you know what, I can't vote for gun control. So you vote against the bill, even though it's a popular issue amongst your constituents. So that's one way, because you're voting your conscience, not based on what your constituents are telling you. Now, the argument that makes that people elected individuals to make decisions. Okay, so there's an argument that people elect individuals to make decisions, and so it's difficult to pinpoint the will of the people. So it's the idea that, wait, hold on a second, I'm going to represent you, but not necessarily what you want. You elected me to be your conscience. So right now you may not want that, but the idea that it's something that a representative is trying to do on your behalf. So as a trustee, you vote for the best interest of the people, even though it might not necessarily be what the majority might be at that particular time. And you can make the argument, if 51% of the constituents are clamoring for you to vote yes on a bill, but 49% say no, well, it's hard to figure out, well, is it the 51% that contacted you, or is it 51%? So you're having to ascertain which will of the people you're going to vote for. So this lends credence to the argument that you should act as a trustee. You can't really accurately figure out what the people want as a whole. So as such, you should vote your conscience. Now, here's the reality. Congressmen, when they make decisions, they're not saying, I'm either delegate or trustee. Some congressmen, maybe it'll be 80% delegate and 20% trustee, or vice versa, and they may switch back and forth. But again, as general rule of thumb, it's the House that's probably a little bit more closer to the people, and therefore they're going to act more as the delegate. And the senators, they have less of an incentive to be as close to the people, again, unless they're right before an election. And so they're going to act maybe a little bit more as a trustee. And again, this is kind of how the Founding Fathers designed the system of delegate versus trustee. Again, current events example, Democrats in conservative districts, again, they may have felt pressure to vote against Obamacare in their role as delegate, because the idea is that they want to go with the will of the people. And again, there's some self-interest there. If they voted for Obamacare, maybe they would have put their jobs on the line. As you know, again, in 2010, a lot of Democrats, maybe they voted as a trustee and they voted for Obamacare, but the people did not want Obamacare, and there are instances where maybe that single issue kept them out of office. So again, you kind of have to see congressmen as juggling many roles besides these two. But again, there are pros and cons of approaching Congress as either delegate or as a trustee. Now, there are definitely some membership privileges of being a congressperson. One of the things I would absolutely love is that you get this cool pin that identifies you as a member. So you have special access to an elevator that is members only. So everyone else, the common folks, have to go through the regular elevators. So there are definitely membership privileges of being a congressperson. But members are given allowances for offices in their district and home states, and they set pay for staff. So you are like the CEO of your little company, of your staff, and you get a budget, again, let's say $1 million, and you can allocate that to your staff members. You can pay your press secretary more than your chief of staff or whatnot. So it's kind of up to you to allocate how much. So you're given a certain budget, and I'm sure there are guidelines, especially for newer members, to figure out how to set that budget. But that's the prerogative of the member. They're kind of in charge of their own small business, so to speak, right? And in addition, they're given travel allowances. And again, that Franklin privilege really helps out because their postal costs are fairly minimal in that regard. A couple of unique things to being a Congress member that I'm sure many average citizens would absolutely love to have is that there's immunity from arrest while conducting congressional business. what does that mean? And how does that work out in practice? So a lot of members, maybe not a lot, but definitely some members have used this excuse to get out of speeding tickets on the way to conduct official business. So wouldn't that be great? You're driving to school, you're driving 90 miles per hour, cop pulls you over and say, you know what, I got to get to class, and that's official business, and the cop doesn't give you a ticket. Now, in theory, cops could give Congress members tickets, but it probably wouldn't hold up in court. And so it's this idea that congressmen, they have unique privileges. Again, the intent of that is to prevent people from capturing congressmen or purposely delaying them from voting on important legislation. And do congressmen sometimes occasionally take advantage of that privilege? Probably, but it doesn't diminish the intent of that rule. But again, you can argue that the public backlash from a congressman consistently abusing this privilege makes it such that it's good to have this type of provision that allows for congressmen to freely get to the vote. Now, once they get there, they have another cool thing that they're able to exercise. They get immunity from libel or slander suits for their speech or debate in Congress. So they have a greater measure of freedom of speech. So I suppose that they could say things about the president, about Congress, that perhaps might be subject to greater scrutiny. There's certain things that you definitely don't want to say as an ordinary citizen. And again, as a congressperson, what you say is a matter of public record on the floor. So yeah, you might not get arrested for saying certain things on the floor of Congress, but if you say certain things, you might not get reelected or even renominated by your party if you say certain controversial things. So again, what Congress is technically allowed to do and what they are allowed to do in this age of social media, where one thing that you might say might be tweeted out and posted on Facebook and Instagram and simultaneously, broadcast on YouTube live. You have to really watch out for these things as a congressperson. A lot of Congress members have gotten into a lot of trouble, with Twitter accounts, tweeting things and saying certain things. So just the proliferation of technology now makes it so that congressmen, while they constitutionally may be permitted to do certain things, if they want to remain in office, it's probably better to exercise some discretion. Now, what are some legislative powers of Congress? Well, again, let's differentiate between the two major types of legislative power. There's express powers and there's implied powers. Now, express powers, that's found in Article 1, Section 8. And they grant specific powers. So exactly that, there's express powers. Now, I don't have the entire list, but there's some examples of things the Constitution says. So you definitely do want to review Article 1, Section 8 to see what are the specific things that Congress does. And again, these things usually, there's not a lot of debate because it's in the Constitution. So both Democrats and Republicans, they are in agreement that, okay, these are things that Congress is permitted to do. They are permitted to collect taxes. Now, income taxes, kind of a different thing. So in the 16th Amendment was granted to permit the collection of income taxes along with tariffs, borrow money, regulate commerce, coin money, establish post offices, and etc. So there are a list of things that Congress is permitted to do. These are called express powers. Now, implied powers, this is a subject of controversy that to this day, members of the Supreme Court will argue vehemently as to what is an acceptable implied power and what is not an implied power. And it really depends on how you interpret this elastic clause. And what is the elastic clause? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 basically allows Congress to execute laws that are necessary and proper, or otherwise known as this elastic clause. And again, this has been used to expand the powers of Congress. For example, something that is not controversial, there's an express power to raise the army, which implies, again, not explicitly, but again, that's why it implies the power to draft men into the military. There's nothing in Congress that expressly allows Congress to draft men into the military, but it's implied because that's necessary and proper for the express power to raise an army, right? Now, the million-dollar question is, does the express power to tax imply the power to enact Obamacare? Now, the answer, according to the Supreme Court, with the passage of Obamacare, was yes. The government has the power to tax, and the idea is that Obamacare, you can choose not to get Obamacare, and if you don't get Obamacare, then you are taxed, and the government has the ability to regulate commerce. They have the ability to tax. And that's an argument that, surprisingly, Chief Justice John Roberts, who aligns with conservatives most of the time, he actually broke with his conservative counterparts and basically declared Obamacare as being constitutional based on the idea of power to tax. So, you know, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. This can be stretched, you know, the Constitution doesn't allow this, but there's an implied power, and usually the power to regulate interstate commerce, that's kind of a big thing. Now, the Constitution or the Supreme Court has actually spoke pretty clearly on certain things. For example, does the power to regulate commerce imply the power to regulate guns in school? And Supreme Court, by a 6-3 decision, they answered a resounding no. This is something that I went over in previous lectures. With the 10th Amendment, Lopez versus the United States, the idea that a gun, a federal law preventing guns from being in the school, that is actually unconstitutional, because the idea that, you know, bringing a gun to school affects interstate commerce, because if you go to school and you bring a gun, eventually you're going to go to school, you're going to go to college, you go to college, you get a degree, you get a degree, you get a job, you participate in interstate commerce. That was too weak of a connection for the justices to determine that, yes, that is an implied power because it is necessary and proper to legislate laws about guns, which will eventually lead to commerce, right? But 3 of the justices actually agreed to that. So this implied powers and what Congress is able to do or not able to do, this is something that is continuing to be a subject of debate in regards to a lot of issues. What role can what role can Congress play in terms of exercising its powers? Now, what are some non-legislative powers? Well, the House selects the president if no majority exists in the Electoral College. So if there's no majority, it goes to the House of Representatives, and each state acts as one vote. California would get one vote, Hawaii would get one vote, Texas. So their delegation would choose a president, and once there's a majority, 26 of the 50 states, then you have the new president. It has happened a couple times. It hasn't happened in recent history. It's never happened in the 20th century, but it is a possibility. Now, the Senate chooses the vice president. So the House chooses the president. The Senate chooses the vice president if no majority exists in the Electoral College. Now, again, that would be interesting, because if you have 2 senators of opposing parties, you know, how would the Senate determine the vice president? That would be kind of an interesting issue. And what would happen if the House selected a Republican president and the Senate selected a Democrat president? So, again, the Constitution doesn't specifically indicate that the political party has to be the same. So it would be kind of interesting what things, you know, what would happen if there was no majority. So I'm sure there are a lot of political junkies out there for the purposes of seeing how the Constitution would be out on display. I'm sure there are folks that would be rooting for a deadlock in the Electoral College to see, all these non-legislative powers of Congress coming to fruition. Congress can propose amendments with 2/3 of vote in both houses. Again, this is a standard way that amendments are adopted, and then 3/4 of state legislatures or via state convention would be used to actually make an amendment part of the Constitution. Now, impeachment powers belongs to the House while the Senate tries and can bring about a conviction. Now, has this ever happened before? Yes and no. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were both impeached but not convicted. With Bill Clinton, his impeachment affair was pretty political, and it went straight party line vote. And Republicans, they had a majority at the time, so they were able to impeach the president. But the Senate, you didn't have that 2/3 of majority, so there was no conviction there. With Andrew Johnson, actually John F. Kennedy actually wrote a book, and part of it had to do with the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. It's called Profiles in Courage, where members actually voted against convicting Andrew Johnson, and it spelled the end of their political career. But they voted against impeachment, or against convicting the president, because they didn't feel the charge of high crimes and misdemeanors was worthy, and so it was an act of political courage. Now, Nixon resigned, and he was never impeached, but it was because impeachment and conviction was near certain. Again, this is the power of the Congress. The ability to impeach was basically the reason behind why Nixon resigned from office. Now, I can't tell you with 100% certainty, but if Nixon knew that he wasn't going to be impeached, or Congress had no power of impeachment and removal, I highly doubt that Richard Nixon would have voluntarily resigned from the highest, most powerful position on earth, arguably, unless there is this power of impeachment. So again, even in trying political times, you see that the system that the founding fathers created actually works well. So this whole power to impeach actually came very critically in Nixon's resignation. Now, the Senate approves presidential appointments by a majority vote. So it has to do with Supreme Court appointments, or the president will appoint. Most recently, Obama appointed a new Federal Reserve chairwoman, Janet Yellen, and that required the Senate approval. And then you also have treaties that require 2/3 of the vote. Now, you're not going to see a whole lot of treaties. Mostly a way to bypass this is through executive agreements, because treaties require 2/3 of approval from the Senate. So when possible, presidents generally try to avoid treaties, and they'll tend to go with executive agreements. Now, how does a bill become a law in the House? Well, the bills begin in either house, except, again, revenue bills, which begin in the House of Representatives via the Ways and Means. The bill is introduced, numbered, and assigned to a committee, and then subcommittee for further study. So HR 1, for example, so a new session in Congress, let's say the year is 2017, and you have a new session in Congress, new Congress takes place, House, they're open to business, and the first bill that they introduce is referred to as HR 1. It's read, and it's assigned to committee and subcommittee. Now, the bill is returned to committee from the subcommittee, and then the committee either approves it or rejects it. And then if it's approved, the Rules Committee sets the terms of debate for the bill. The bill goes to the floor of the House, and based on the rules, the bill is debated by the House. A vote is taken. Excuse me. A vote is taken, and if passed, the bill is sent to the Senate. So again, to kind of review what's going on here, the bill is introduced, numbered, and assigned to committee. The committee goes to subcommittee. They hear on the pros and cons. experts testify, it goes to committee, and committee votes for it. If it's approved, it goes to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee decide the rules of the debate, and it goes on the floor. If it passes, then it goes to the other part of Congress, assuming it already hasn't passed that side, if that makes any sense. So this is from the House side. Now, from the Senate side, a bill is introduced, numbered, and assigned to a committee. For example, the first bill that would be assigned in the Senate would be referred to as S1. So the bill may be assigned to a subcommittee for further study. So again, it's assigned to a committee, and then the subcommittee, they're responsible for hearing all the testimony, again, from the Senate side. The bill is going to be returned to committee, where again, it's going to be approved or rejected. Now, here is the one of the significant differences between the House and the Senate. There is no Rules Committee that exists in the Senate. So there's no equivalent. So that being said, there's a lot more leeway for individual senators to express their desires on how things are going to take place. Whereas the Rules Committee, an individual House member cannot simply take over that entire chamber. Whereas it has been done where an individual senator can delay action again if that senator has enough support. There are ways for individual senators to exert their own will or ego, depending on how you look at it. Whereas individual House members with such a large group, they don't have that individual ability to single-handedly stop a bill from being voted upon. And again, so if approved, the senators will debate the bill. Sometimes they'll debate on and on and on. So they take a little bit longer. And again, this is part of what the Founding Fathers wanted. They wanted more debates and more reasoning to be taken place in the upper chamber. Conference committees resolve differences between the House and the Senate versions of the bill. And again, compromise versions cannot contain new material. So again, once both versions of a bill, they're passed slightly different, they go to conference committee, they make the exact same bill, and they shoot it back to the Senate and the House. They vote on it, and then once it is passed in exactly the same version, that bill goes to the president. So both bills vote, or both houses vote, and then the president can either do one of four things. The president can sign the bill, veto the bill, allow the bill to become law without signing, or pocket veto the bill. So I'll explain a little bit more what each of these four options entail. First one's really easy. The president can sign the bill. So the president can sign the bill, and it now has the force of law. The president can veto the bill. The president will rarely actually do that. The threat of the veto is probably more potent than the veto itself, but the president can veto the bill, in which case it goes back to Congress, and Congress can override the veto with 2/3 majority. Or the president, one way to express protest about a bill but without actually vetoing it is just do nothing, and if Congress is still in session, the bill will become law. So this might be like a passive way of saying, I don't like this bill the way it's written, so I'm not going to sign it into law, but I'm not going to prevent it from being part of the law. Or the president can pocket veto, meaning if Congress goes out of session, then the bill will automatically be vetoed. Again, 3 and 4, in fact, 2, 3, and 4 rarely ever happen. It's really the threat of the veto that exists. And so if a bill can somehow make it through Congress and be signed into law, again, rarely will a bill actually complete all these processes. Maybe 3 to 5% of all bills are actually enacted into law. If that happens, very rarely will the president do anything other than sign it. But again, different options exist for the president. And again, some presidents will veto more so than others. And again, even if the president does wield the veto, bills can be overridden with 2/3 of the vote of both houses. So what are some legislative tactics that are unique to the Senate in particular? Again, we mentioned in the Senate, because there are so few members, there's less rules. So they're not subject to the same kind of constricting rules that the House is. I mean, it makes sense logically. If you had 100 people in a room together, you can argue that they can reasonably act as gentlemen, right? Whereas if you have 435 people, it doesn't matter how reasonable they are, it's just going to be kind of chaotic. So it makes sense to have rules in the House, but not so much in the Senate. Now, there is filibuster and cloture. There's pork barrel legislation and log rolling and riders. So I kind of lumped them into these different categories. Well, filibuster and cloture, this is a tactic that some people get frustrated about, but it makes for good party drama. So if there's an unpopular legislation with one party, yet the majority controls the chamber and they want to pass a bill, then the minority party can filibuster a bill. And what does that mean? Because there's unlimited debate in an attempt to stall action on a bill. Okay, because there's unlimited debate, they can attempt to stall action. So this could be either passage of an unpopular law, or it could be to prevent a judicial nomination from getting his or her post, right? And again, it occurs in the Senate because of unlimited debate. There are no rules as to how long a debate can go. So if a senator decides to filibuster, then it's something that that a senator has the right to do. Strom Thurmond famously tried to filibuster, and he was successful in not stopping the passage of the bill, but at least delaying passage by speaking 21 hours straight. So he read the phone book, he read the Constitution, he read the Bible, he just read a bunch of things to maintain the floor. And again, because there's no limit as to how long you are permitted to say something, he basically finally relinquished the floor after 21 hours. So he failed in his filibuster attempt, depending on what your definition of failure is. So any senator has the power to do something crazy like that. Whereas in the House, it just, can you imagine if House members had the power to speak 21 hours each? Nothing would get done. So one way to block a filibuster is cloture. So it requires 60 senators basically to end debate. So this is the idea that even if you have a majority in Congress, really the magic number is 60 because you have the power of cloture, and so you can end an individual's senator's attempt to filibuster. So if you only have a majority, like 51 or 55, then it's very difficult to end the filibuster. Now there are ways. For example, Obama didn't have the cloture supermajority to pass Obamacare, but there are different provisions in the Senate that basically only requires a majority vote, and that's what Obama decided to use in order to pass Obamacare. So there are definitely different ways that congressmen can maneuver, especially in the Senate. Senate is an arcane institution with a lot of different rules that if you're not aware of, then there's a lot of different things that the opposing party can slip by. Now again, pork barrel legislation. A lot of politicians rail at pork barrel legislation. At the same time, they're the ones that engage in pork barrel legislation, because pork barrel legislation is bad for the country when you take it as a whole. If you're a congressman, pork barrel legislation is good. You are bringing the pork back to your district. So pork barrel legislation is an attempt to provide funds and projects for members, state or district. And absolutely, there are a lot of legislative tactics that try to include benefits to a certain district where it might not make sense as a whole, but individually, you are elected to represent as a delegate. So you're trying to get whatever you can for your constituency, but it may come at the expense of the country. And there's a tactic called log rolling, in which members gain support for favorable legislation in exchange for support for another members. So you scratch my you scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours, right? So this is the idea of quid pro quo, the idea that there's a lot of tit for tat going on in Congress, and that's one of the things that actually do happen. And again, writers are attached to legislation that probably would not stand the scrutiny on its own. So if there's a particular interest that a congressperson has, but he or she knows that that alone won't survive a bill, smart way to try to get that passed is attach it as a rider. And again, if so many different riders are attached to the bill, it's called a Christmas tree for obvious reasons. Just like a Christmas tree has all these different ornaments, if there's enough riders, individually it might be only a couple million here and there, but if you add that total up, then there's hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars that are going towards individual constituencies, and sometimes they're outrageous, and sometimes when they're reported to the press, the bridge to nowhere, a bridge that is using federal money to bridge a bill to build a bridge that accommodates 50 people, or building an airport in which that clearly benefits a congressperson, but doesn't really benefit a whole lot of people. Things like that happen because of these log rolling and riders and pork barrel legislation as a whole. So let's take a look at some example questions here. Which of the following is not an exclusive committee in the House of Representatives? This one's really easy here. Ways and Means, absolutely an exclusive committee. Rules, absolutely. Appropriations, absolutely. Agriculture is not, and so therefore none of the above is incorrect. So the correct answer is agriculture, because it is not an exclusive committee. Example number 2. Which of the following is not true of a member in Congress? So there are 4 things that are true. What is not true? Okay. So let's take a look. Again, I like these types of multiple choice questions because this is going to help you with FRQs. If you're asked what are different roles of congressmen, it might seem like an easy question, but you want to make sure you have the correct AP government lingo to be able to answer this. So members of Congress act as policymakers and make public policy through passage of legislation. Absolutely, they do that. Absolutely. Okay, so absolutely they do that. Let's not use that color. Let's use the blue right here. Now, one other thing here. Members of Congress work for their constituents. Absolutely. I mean, they're supposed to work for their constituents. Okay, so that's also true, so it's not the correct answer. Okay, members of Congress work to support their political party platform. If you are a good Republican or a good Democrat, then you absolutely are going to support your party's platform. Okay, members of Congress usually get most of their work done in committees or subcommittees. That's absolutely true. So the answer, even without looking at E, we'll go ahead and read it. As delegates, members of Congress vote on matters based on their conscience. If they said as trustees, that would be correct, or based on what the people want, that would be correct. But again, as delegates, you are not voting your conscience, you're voting what the people want. As trustees, you're voting your conscience. So the answer is E, because you switched out what delegates versus trustees. So this definition is at odds with one another. Example number 3. Which of the following is considered a non-legislative power of Congress? So let's take a look. Let's eliminate the ones that are legislative powers, or that's not a non-legislative power. Power to impeach, that is a legislative power. Okay. Power to declare, actually no, power to impeach is a non-legislative power. So that's actually the correct answer. So we can actually stop there. So that being said, what are some legislative powers? So things that deal with, passing laws. Okay, that would be considered legislative powers. Power to declare war, absolutely. Congress has the power to declare war. Now, even though it seems like the president is the one that's aggressively pursuing war, the president is commander in chief, but the power to actually declare war which hasn't taken place since World War II, actually lies with Congress. The power to tax, absolutely. Again, I got to start with the Ways and Means Committee in the House. The power to regulate commerce, absolutely. And then the power to make laws which are necessary and proper. And again, that is subject to a lot of debate and discussion, but these four things are definitely legislative powers. And the power to impeach is a power given to Congress, but it's not legislative. It's more of a judicial power that's given to Congress. Okay, example number 4. Which of the following is not a step that a bill takes on its journey towards becoming a law? The bill is debated. Well, obviously, a bill is absolutely debated before it becomes a law. Okay, the bill is voted on, at which time it may pass or be defeated. Absolutely, that's kind of the final step. A bill goes onto the floor and it either passes or it's defeated. The bill may be assigned to subcommittee for debate. Absolutely, this is where the work of Congress is done, through committee hearings. The bill is numbered with the prefix of HR in the House and S in the Senate. And, basically it goes through each of the houses, and then there's a conference committee that reconciles the differences, and it goes to the president after both houses pass it, and then it becomes a law. The bill is introduced by constituents from the majority party in power in Congress. This sounds like it could be true. I mean, I use correct words, but constituents means that it's introduced by people that are not congressmen, and the only individual that can introduce a bill into law is actual members of Congress. The president himself cannot introduce a law. It's the members in Congress, so the answer is E, because that is not a step that a bill takes in becoming a law. And finally, question number 5. Which of the following is not considered to be a contributing factor to the incumbency effect? So we talked about this originally, but kind of put it all together. Again, Congress is, the incumbency effect is much more prominent with House members. The election rate, let's just say it's roughly 90% the re-election rate, whereas the re-election rate for senators is closer to like 70%. So what is not a contributing factor? So there definitely are. Name recognition, absolutely. So this is not one of the answers. Name recognition absolutely does help you get reelected. If you're a congressperson, you constantly have your name in the media, you're sending out mailers through your legislative office, and you're simultaneously sending out mailers through your campaign because you raise more money than your opponent, and you're flooding your district with your name out there. So you have advantage there. Voting record, absolutely. It is taken into account, and you do have a voting record. Now, it can come and hurt you, but for the most part, you can say you showed leadership. A challenger can only say what he or she will do, and so it becomes difficult to compete against someone that has an established record. Educational background. This would be one of those things where, maybe you're comfortable putting that as an answer, but it's not necessarily the case. It could be the case where the incumbent has more education, but not necessarily. Experience in campaigning. Absolutely. If you're incumbent, most likely you have more experience than your challenger, so it does come into play. Now, is it possible that a challenger used to be incumbent and has more experience than the incumbent? It is possible, but very unlikely. One case, actually, Ron Paul, aside from running for president, he was a medical doctor, and what's kind of very unique in his situation, he was a House member in Texas. He won the House of Representative seats 3 separate times as a non-incumbent, and I think that's pretty impressive, a political feat. So he originally ran, obviously any congressperson originally ran as a non-incumbent. He resigned from the Senate 2 separate times, one time to quit the party to run the president, one time just to return to private practice. And when he returned, he was a non-incumbent, and he won partly because he had a lot of name recognition. And unique to Ron Paul, he actually personally, as an obstetrician, delivered his own constituents. Can you imagine that? Can you vote for me? I delivered you. I mean, that would be a pretty impressive thing that you could say in a campaign that's very unique to Ron Paul. In fact, he actually did deliver about 4,000 of his constituents. So again, experience in campaigning absolutely helps, because that helps you with a lot of different areas. Visibility, constituents. You're always out there. You're meeting and greeting, and you're awarding medals, and you're recognizing people. So people form a positive impression of you as congressman. And again, as one of the things that's consistent is that people are upset at Congress as a whole. They think Congress is inefficient. They hate Congress. Approval rating is 9%. Maybe if they're lucky, 13%. If they ask you, do you approve of your congressman? Then you see something closer to like 60, 70, maybe even 80%, right? And the reality, it's because if you're visible, it's one thing to not vote for an incumbent because you never see that person. But if that person helps your daughter get into West Point, you may not agree with that person's political views, but you are sure as heck going to vote for that person. So based on this elimination, there's nothing inherent about an incumbent having maybe a better educational background. In fact, the example I gave in the previous lecture, Jay Chen versus Ed Royce. Ed Royce was a college graduate, and he owned his business from Cal State Fullerton. He graduated, so he did have a college background. And if you look at Jay Chen, the challenger, he was actually a Harvard graduate, and so you can argue that he had the advantage in the educational background. But again, people don't necessarily vote that. Sometimes it can actually hurt you if you have a Harvard degree. People might consider you to be a little bit too elitist. So it's not necessarily going to be something that is a contributing factor, at least to the incumbency effect. Definitely good to have on your resume. It doesn't necessarily hurt, but again, it could be more of a neutral characteristic. Thank you for watching educator.com.